Hugo Grin was born into a prosperous Jewish family in Berechovo in what was then Czechoslovakia, and is now in Ukraine. His parents, who married in 1929, were Geza Grin, a timber merchant, and Bella Neufeld. Grin's family were deported to Auschwitz in 1944. Hugo and his mother survived, but his 10-year-old Gabriel was gassed on arrival at Auschwitz, while his father died a few days after he and Hugo were liberated from Gunskirchen, a subcamp of Mauthausen, in May 1945. Hugo went on to train for the rabbinate at Hebrew Union College. He later went on to serve many years as the senior rabbi of one of the most prominent Reform congregations in the UK, the West London Synagogue of British Jews. He was beloved by Jews and non-Jews alike, who frequently got to hear him on British radio. Rabbi Hugo Grin famously told a story of his father in the winter of 1944, while they were together in the concentration camp. Having announced that it was the eve of Hanukkah, he took a homemade clay bowl and lit a wick immersed in his precious, now melted ration of margarine. Before he could recite the blessing, Hugo looked at his father and protested, "We need the food. We can't afford to waste it on a candle." His father looked at Hugo and then at the lamp and responded, "You and I have seen it is possible to live up to 3 weeks without food. We once lived almost 3 days without water. But you can't live at all without hope." I've been meditating on the theme of hope for some months now. It's the focus of all of my High Holy Day sermons and services this year. Now, there's no moment in history when we have not needed this message, but over this past year, through the conversations that I've had with our teens and the adult members of our community, I've been aware of many carrying a heavy burden. Even in the midst of what might be relatively comfortable lives, there is concern for the health and safety of our youth, both physical and mental. There is concern for the sustainability of our planet and deep uncertainty about the lengths that we may truly need to go to confront and combat climate change. There's worry about the stability and dependency of our democracy, both here and abroad. Some find themselves walking around in a constant state of anxiety and stress. In this context, despair is more of a kind of fatigue, a loss of faith. But it's something that we can overcome. If being here now on our holiest day of the year cannot lift us from these dark and despondent feelings, then I would question, what is the ultimate purpose of our work together? Our faith is filled with spiritual tools and texts that can inspire and lift us, just like that tiny candle that Hugo Grin's father lit in the concentration camp. It can give us hope, and hope is what we need right now. It's important in thinking about the possibility of hope to say what hope is not. And here, and for many examples and citations that I'm going to share this morning, I'm going to draw on a book by Rebecca Solnit called Hope in the Dark, Untold Histories, Wild Possibilities. She explains that hope is not the belief that everything was, is, or will be fine. The evidence is all around us of tremendous suffering and tremendous destruction. The hope I'm interested in, she says, is about broad perspectives with specific possibilities, ones that invite and demand that we act. It's not a sunny everything is getting better narrative, although it might be a counter to the everything is getting worse narrative. And she goes on to put it this way: hope is the belief that what we do matters, even though how and when it may matter, who and what it may impact, are not things that we can know beforehand. We may not, in fact, know them afterward either, but they matter all the same, and history is full of people whose influence was most powerful after they are gone. But it's important to emphasize that hope is only a beginning. It's not a substitute for action, only the basis for it. Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced, said James Baldwin. Hope gets you there, but it's work that gets you through. We must accept finite disappointment, but never lose infinite hope, says Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Hope then goes hand in hand with action. And this is why on Rosh Hashanah morning I introduced our youth and their parents to the rabbinic myth of Miriam's well, a well of water that, according to rabbinic midrash, was created at the end of the sixth day of creation, just as human beings were being created. The message being that we rely not only on the actual well from the water to sustain us, but on the spiritual sustenance that comes from a well that represents hope. Utter despair leads to giving up. Hope, even in some of the most desperate of situations, is that we will figure out a way forward, or that someone will hear our cry for help and will perhaps show up when we need them. You may have seen the art piece in the lobby entitled Miriam's Well on your way in this morning. The well is filled with what appear to be blank pieces of blue waves of paper. But in fact, those papers are not blank. Everyone who was at that service imprinted with their minds on one side of the paper a specific hope that they had, and then on the other side, a specific action that they felt that they could take to make that hope into more of a reality. Why do we look to our biblical sources and even these rabbinic mythical stories created to extract some deeper significance from Torah to find messages of hope? Solnit explains it like this when she cites the brilliant Christian theologian Walter Brueggemann. Memory produces hope in the same way that amnesia produces despair. It's an extraordinary statement, one that reminds us that though hope is about the future, grounds for hope lie in the records and recollections of the past. For the Jewish people, our ancient past provides powerful narratives of hope, not necessarily because it's grounded in precise historical fact, but because these stories are the foundations of our existence as a people with a unique and distinct identity. Pew Research from 2013 demonstrated that the Passover Seder remains one of the most observed ritual occasions by Jews in the United States. Over 75% have a Seder experience. Compare that with the 53% who fast on Yom Kippur. Obviously, a ritual that centers around eating versus fasting is bound to be a little more popular. But I do think there's a little bit more to it than that. We're drawn to the retelling of our founding story, the journey from slavery to freedom, out of which we become a people, when together we connect to our higher purpose through a covenant at Mount Sinai. And we take pride not only in our own experience of that story throughout the centuries, but of its role in inspiring the freedom journeys of other peoples, and not least of all in this country, of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the Civil Rights Movement. But even more than that, the freedom story that grounds our origins has also given us hope in the darkest moments of our history. This is why Mechamocha has become such a moment of uplift in our daily liturgy. It's our song of redemption, extracted from the Song of the Sea after we crossed over the Sea of Reeds and escaped Pharaoh's army. We read in our Shabbat prayer book, the Exodus lasted a moment enduring forever. What happened once upon a time happens all the time. And just before we sing those words, we sometimes read, "It is eternally Egypt. There is a better place, a promised land, that there is no way to get from here to there, except by joining hands and marching together." In his book, The Jew in the Lotus, Roger Kamenetz writes of a group of rabbis who were invited to visit with the Dalai Lama. The Dalai Lama was particularly interested in the context of the exile that his followers were facing from Tibet for what was an unknown but possibly very long time, how the Jewish people had maintained their identity and faith for so many centuries without Israel. One of the rabbis on that trip was Rabbi Joy Levitt from New York City, and she describes a moment of insight that Kamenetz records in his book. After the rabbis had recited Birkat Hamazon, the grace after meal, the Tibetans became very moved upon learning that Jews pray for the rebuilding of Jerusalem after meals in their homes. They immediately made plans to see if they might write a Tibetan prayer articulating their yearning for Lhasa. I was stunned by the new light suddenly cast on this very familiar prayer. I have recited grace after meals on Shabbat my entire life, and yet had never really grasped its role in preserving the Zionist dream in the hearts and the minds of Jews throughout the generations. Since my return from India, she recalled, I have never recited those words without thinking both of the Tibetans and my deep longing for Zion at peace. Our Jewish rituals and stories can provide a cornucopia of inspiration to guide us in our journey from hope to action. Memory of joy and liberation can become a navigational tool, an identity, a gift. To recognize the momentousness of what has happened is to apprehend what might still happen, writes Solnit. What other stories can be told? Let's now turn to those examples of inspiration that helps us to understand how hope works. Seldom do we see transformation in an instant. Success comes usually after a long haul, and often after a series of smaller failures. So we cannot use instant results as our measure of hope. Solnit, in examining and researching a great many revolutions and significant inspirational changes from around the world, offers the allegory of a mushroom patch. After a rain, she says, mushrooms appear on the surface of the earth as if from nowhere. Many do so from a sometimes vast underground fungus that remains invisible and largely unknown. What we call mushrooms, mycologists call the fruiting body of the larger, less visible fungus. Uprisings and revolutions are often considered to be spontaneous, but less visible, long-term organizing and groundwork, or underground work, often laid the foundation. As an illustration of this mushroom principle, she cites the work of Adam Hochschild in his 2005 book, Bury the Chains. He tells the story of how a dozen or so original activists gathered at a London printer's shop. From that point onward, this handful of hopefuls created a movement that in half a century abolished slavery in the British Empire and helped spark the abolition movement that ended slavery in the United States a quarter century or so later. Part of the story is about the imagination and determination of a few key figures, for sure, but part of it is about a change of heart, whereby enough people came to believe that slavery was an intolerable cruelty to bring its day to an end, despite the profitability of the institution to the powerful who defended it. It was arguments and sermons and editorials and pamphlets and conversations that changed the mind of the public. Stories, for the decisions were mostly made in London, encouraged by witnesses and slave revolts abroad. The atrocities, though, were mostly out of the sight of the majority of the audience. So it required imagination and empathy and information to make abolition a cause and then a victory. In those 5 decades, anti-slavery sentiments went from being a radical idea to being the status quo. I think of the journey from the Stonewall riots of 1969, when police raided the Stonewall Inn for no reason other than the customers of the bar were gay, to the crowds of people who gathered in and outside that same inn in 2011, 42 years later, when New York State signed marriage equality into law. I was there. The buzz was quite amazing. At that time, New York was only the 6th state to have signed marriage equality into law, but it was just a handful of years later, in 2015, that the Supreme Court made marriage equality for all the law of the land. Could the men who were tired of being harassed and victimized by authorities, who took to the streets in anger in 1969, have imagined how far we'd have come by 2015? In his campaign speeches in 1977 and 78, Harvey Milk would famously end with these words: "Without hope, not only gays, but those who are black, the Asians, the disabled, the seniors, the us's, without hope, the us's give up. I know that you can't live on hope alone, but without it, life is not worth living. And you and you and you have got to give them hope," he said. And we see that sometimes hope is grounded in grief, even anger. Patrisse Cullors, one of the founders of Black Lives Matter, early on described the movement's mission as to provide hope and inspiration for collective action, to build collective power, to achieve collective transformation, rooted in grief and rage, but pointed towards visions and dreams. It's a statement that acknowledges that grief and hope can coexist. Hope is not something that we no longer need when we've achieved an outcome. Most of the things we care about require our ongoing effort and attention so that we continue to make progress. When it comes to environmental sustainability, for example, we will never be able to say that the whales have been saved. We might be able to say in this moment that we have succeeded in protecting them from going extinct. It's like this with much of the action that we need to take to address the sustainability of our ecosystems. And even when in the short term we think we failed, we cannot give up. Ecosystems that have been ravaged by development and poisoned by chemicals have later been restored by the efforts of persistent campaigners who did the legwork to get new legislation passed, to protect an area of land, and to help restore the biodiversity found there. I was really struck by something that one of the true inspirations of this moment, Greta Thunberg, recently said. On the surface, it might appear to fly in the face of all that I have said so far this morning. She said as she got off that solar-powered boat, "Adults keep saying we owe it to the young people to give them hope. But I don't want your hope. I don't want you to be hopeful. I want you to panic. I want you to feel the fear every day. I want you to feel the fear every day that I feel, and then I want you to act." Well, of course she is right. And I hope that I've made that clear today. We cannot only put our hope in others to make things happen while we do nothing ourselves to move things forward. We cannot be dormant, silent bystanders. We Reformed Jews don't believe in a Messiah that will appear on earth and make everything right for us. We believe each and every one of us can do something to move us all incrementally toward a messianic era, a better future. And Solnit puts it like this: hope is an axe you break down doors with in an emergency, because hope should shove you out the door, because it will take everything you have to steer the future away from endless war, from the annihilation of the earth's treasures, and the grinding down of the poor and the marginal. Hope just means another world might be possible, not promised, not guaranteed. Hope calls for action. Action is impossible without hope. So let us dig deep, and we can fill our well with hope again. We can be not only the ones who tell the redemption stories of our past, but create the redemption stories of our present and future. We can speak out, show up, lobby, campaign, commit to the changes that we want to see in the world. Don't wait for hope to find you. We all have the ability to manifest hope through the actions that we take each and every day, working to create the community, the country, and the world that we want to live in. Ken Yehi Ratzon, may it be so.